In July 2025, a thunderclap reverberated across Africa when the International Criminal Court issued a stunning announcement. Kenyan President William Ruto was now officially under preliminary examination for potential crimes against humanity. The accusations were grave, allegedly authorizing and defending a brutal state crackdown on nationwide protests that left over 70 civilians dead, hundreds wounded, and entire communities terrorized. But rather than cooperate, Ruto chose confrontation. Broadcast live to the nation, flanked by generals and national flags, he denounced the ICC as a neo-colonial circus where African suffering is paraded for Western applause. It was a calculated move and not his first skirmish with The Hague. But this time, the landscape had shifted. Because as the world fixated on the fault lines of international justice, something seismic was unfolding elsewhere. From the heart of West Africa, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood before a gathering of African leaders and made a declaration that pierced the moment. This is not about shielding leaders. This is about protecting our people. Africa must no longer outsource its justice. It was more than rhetoric, it was a reckoning. So what happens when a sitting president defies an international court and the court hesitates to act? What becomes of law when blood flows in the streets of Nairobi and both state and global institutions retreat into silence? And most importantly, when those meant to guard justice abandon the people, who will stand in their place? Stay with us, because this story isn't just about courts or presidents. It's about the very meaning of justice, and who dares to fight for it. But first, tell us, where are you watching from? Let's see how far the voice of African resistance can echo. June 2025. Nairobi. What began as a wave of frustration over a punishing new budget exploded into the largest uprising in Kenya since independence. The Ruto administration had announced crippling new taxes on fuel, food, internet access, even diapers. For ordinary Kenyans already battered by inflation and inequality, it felt like the final betrayal. On June 17, the capital ignited. But not from outsiders. From within. Tens of thousands filled the streets, from Kisumu to Mombasa, Eldoret to Nakuru, united in defiance. Students, teachers, mothers, veterans, chanting, Hoki yetu. Our rights, and Hachapengwingwi. We won't be controlled. But the government didn't listen. Instead, it unleashed force. Viral videos captured the horror. In Tom Mboya Street, police opened fire on demonstrators. In Kibera, a young girl sobbed beside her unconscious mother. In Metha, women were dragged into armored vehicles without charges, families left in limbo. The violence was swift, systematic, and chillingly familiar. By early July, human rights groups including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Kenya's own National Human Rights Commission issued urgent condemnations. Their joint reports painted a grim picture. 70+ confirmed deaths. Over 550 injured. More than 500 arrested, many without due process. In response, Nairobi lit up with mourning and defiance. Mothers held nightly vigils in Uhuru Park. Artists painted towering murals of resistance. Volunteers built memorials from candles, banners, and photographs of the dead. What had begun as a protest over taxation became a national moral uprising. And then, on July 4, Ruto spoke. But not to grieve. Not to acknowledge the dead. Instead, he waged war on the court that dared to investigate him. The ICC is a foreign weapon dressed as justice, he declared. Kenya will never kneel to imperial blackmail. The reaction was instant. In diplomatic halls, shock. On Kenyan streets, rage. In The Hague, a formal preliminary investigation was announced, citing serious concern over state-sanctioned abuses. But to many Kenyans, it rang hollow. Why now? Why not when we cried out the first time? A grieving mother told journalists in Matha. Across town, graffiti read, "The court watches. The people bleed." By mid-July, this was no longer just a protest. It was a reckoning with the nation's soul. And in a continent where justice has too often been delayed, denied, or imported from afar, a new conversation is beginning. Who gets to define justice for Africa? And more urgently, who will defend the people when the laws don't? Across Nairobi, a quiet resistance began to rise, not just in protest, but in poetry. Young people organized underground readings, community protection patrols, and truth-telling forums. The smoke that lingered in the air wasn't just from burning tires. It carried the weight of history, the scent of betrayal, the echo of a deeper question. What happens to democracy when a nation cries and its leaders turn away? What meaning does sovereignty still hold when it becomes a weapon against the very people it claims to serve? By July, Kenya was no longer just rejecting a finance bill. It was demanding its voice back. President William Ruto is no stranger to The Hague. In 2013, as Kenya's deputy president, he stood before the International Criminal Court, accused of orchestrating the post-election violence of 2007-08, violence that killed more than 1,000 people and displaced over 600,000. The case was damning. Eyewitnesses described incitement, armed youth militias, and targeted terror. But slowly, the case unraveled. Key witnesses vanished. Others recanted. The prosecution cited witness tampering, political pressure, and obstruction. Eventually, the charges were dropped, not because the crimes didn't happen, but because they could no longer prove who was responsible. Ruto walked free. But freedom did not bring humility. In the years that followed, his administration began tightening its grip on media, opposition voices, and civil society. Security forces were no longer just protectors. They became enforcers of power. Journalists faced cyber attacks. Students were detained for organizing rallies. And in opposition strongholds like Kisumu and Matha, the cost of dissent was measured not in votes, but in blood. Under Ruto, the Kenyan state no longer merely governed. It commanded. If Kenya's past teaches anything, it's that justice delayed is not just denied, it is erased. Because when a leader escapes judgment once, what limits remain? What is to stop him from believing he is untouchable? Immune? Unanswerable to the cries of his own people. In 2022, nation media journalists were targeted after airing reports on police brutality. In 2024, university students were arrested without charge for peacefully protesting school closures and tuition hikes. And by 2025, these weren't isolated incidents. They were a pattern. A signal. A warning. So when the finance bill protests erupted in June, the government's response wasn't reform. It was repression. And then came July 4th, the broadcast that shook the world. Live from State House Nairobi, with the national flag behind him and military officials beside him, President Ruto addressed the nation. He did not mourn. He did not take responsibility. Instead, he stared into the camera and said, "No foreign court will ever judge me." The ICC, he claimed, was an insult to Kenya's sovereignty. It was not an apology. It was a threat. What kind of leader, facing allegations of mass abuse, answers not with accountability, but with defiance? What kind of republic shields violence, then has the audacity to call it security? That speech echoed far beyond Nairobi. International observers condemned it. Legal experts warned of creeping authoritarianism. But for ordinary Kenyans, the speech didn't signal strength. It confirmed abandonment. In Umoja, a working-class neighborhood, hundreds gathered for a candlelight vigil. Photos of victims lay across the pavement, young men in school uniforms, mothers, students, fathers. Some candles flickered beside empty backpacks. In the crowd, a woman held up a sign. "If the ICC is silent, we are already dead." In Eldoret, the town that once cheered Ruto's rise, graffiti appeared on government walls. "He was our son, but not our voice." In Mombasa, fishermen marched along the coastline holding placards. "Justice has no borders." Across Kenya, grief turned into clarity. The country wasn't just mourning its dead, it was reckoning with a deeper truth. That the man once portrayed as a victim of global injustice had become the architect of domestic repression. That a leader once acquitted by international courts now acted as though justice no longer applied to him at all. At a youth forum in Nakuru, a student asked a question that since spread across African airwaves. If both The Hague and the High Court in Nairobi stay silent, who will try the President of Kenya? The room fell quiet. And in that silence lived the ache of a continent far too familiar with unpunished power. Because this is not just a legal dilemma. It is a human one. What becomes of a people when leaders forget they are servants, not sovereigns? When power becomes inheritance, not responsibility? Kenya, long hailed as a democratic anchor in East Africa, now stood at the edge of a moral cliff. And William Ruto, once seen as a reformer, now cast a long, chilling shadow over the very institutions he once vowed to defend. The world is watching. But the question is no longer will justice come. It's who will bring it if the courts won't. As global institutions fell into silence, a voice broke through from the Sahel, unshaken, unmistakably African. At an emergency summit in Ouagadougou, with senior envoys from Mali, Niger, Congo, and beyond, the world expected another round of diplomatic hedging. But instead, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stepped forward and said what many had only whispered. This is not about protecting leaders. It's about protecting people. His words rang across the chamber, unfiltered, unscripted, and utterly unlike anything African diplomacy had heard in years. No legalese. No careful euphemisms. Just a clear indictment. Africa can no longer outsource justice to The Hague, where verdicts come too late and never without geopolitical cost. From Kenya to Sudan, Libya to the DRC, evidence had vanished, victims had been ignored, and perpetrators had walked free under the shadow of international bureaucracy. How many more graves must be dug? Traoré asked. Before truth matters more than treaties. Then came the moment that electrified the continent. A bold, audacious call, the creation of a People's African Court. Not a courtroom for regimes to polish their image. A new judicial body built by Africans, for Africans, to deliver the justice the world had refused. Traoré laid out three uncompromising pillars. To prosecute sitting governments and military regimes for ordering the repression of peaceful protest or extrajudicial killings, no matter their alliances, no matter their status. To hold multinational corporations accountable, those who plunder African minerals, poison rivers, exploit labor, and vanish behind legal shields the moment communities resist. To investigate covert foreign interventions, whether military, financial, or digital, that destabilize African democracies under the guise of humanitarian aid or trade. If global justice cannot look Africa in the eye without prejudice, he declared, then Africa must learn to judge itself. His tone turned fierce. His gaze didn't flinch. Too long have we suffered while justice spoke a foreign tongue. If we must kneel before law, let it be a law born of our soil. Spoken in our languages. Rooted in our pain. Answerable to our people. The room, stunned for a heartbeat, rose in thunderous applause. Delegates from Mali and Niger pledged immediate support. Observers from South Sudan, Chad, Eritrea signaled interest. Across the continent, from Ghanaian airwaves to Cameroonian law schools, the idea sparked a fire. In Senegal, protest leaders called it, our Nuremberg, finally in our own voice. In Cape Town, artists painted murals of Traoré beside the words, justice begins here. Halfway through his speech, cameras rolling and live streams exploding across the continent, Traoré paused and stared into the lens. If you believe justice should begin with the people, not power, type Amen in the comments. And tell us what justice means to you, today. But boldness has its price. As momentum grew, so did opposition. Critics called the court a fantasy. Western diplomats dismissed it as political theater. Some feared it could be weaponized for personal vendettas. Yet even those who doubted couldn't ignore the symbolism. A young, battle-hardened leader once dismissed as a populist was now offering his continent something no foreign court ever had, self-determined justice. What does it mean when justice no longer wears foreign robes? When its judges know the names of bombed villages, poisoned streams, and mothers who still wait? Can such a court truly succeed where others failed? Or will it, too, be buried beneath political pressure? For now, history is being written in motion. Burkina Faso designated 14 hectares outside Ouagadougou to construct the first judicial complex. Mali dispatched constitutional experts to design its legal foundation. Congo pledged initial funding for operations. At the center stood Traoré. Not seeking immunity, but daring to dismantle impunity. In a world where courts protect the powerful and silence the weak, Burkina Faso chose to speak. Not for applause. Not for headlines. But for the millions still waiting for justice, with nothing left but memory and hope. The International Criminal Court was born with the promise of transcending borders, rising above politics, and shielding the vulnerable. But in practice, it often delivered justice through the lens of empire, not empathy. Now, Africa has a question to answer for itself. Can a court built from the ground up, by victims, activists, and communities, finally do what no one else dared? Judge the powerful. Without fear. Without favor. Without foreign permission. That story is no longer hypothetical. It's being built, one pillar at a time. For many across Africa, the promise of international justice has curdled into bitter irony. Since its founding in 2002, the International Criminal Court, ICC, has launched more than 30 cases, and over two-thirds of them have targeted African leaders. From Sudan's Omar al-Bashir to Kenya's William Ruto, from the Central African Republic to Côte d'Ivoire, The Hague has spoken loudly, but only when the accused wore African skin. But where was this court when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, a war that, according to Brown University's Watson Institute, claimed over 300,000 civilian lives? Where was the courtroom for George W. Bush? For Donald Rumsfeld? For Tony Blair? The world watched as cities crumbled, hospitals were leveled, and families were wiped from census records, yet no indictments came. No general summoned. No leaders tried. What is the value of justice that stops at a passport? What credibility survives when law kneels before empire? In 2011, NATO launched a bombing campaign in Libya, dismantling one of Africa's most stable nations. The only man indicted by the ICC. Muammar Gaddafi, the leader NATO sought to remove. No European commander, no Western architect of destruction, no foreign official who authored the chaos was ever summoned. Only the African. Meanwhile, in Mali, France continues to extract gold through opaque corporate proxies, companies accused of underpaying labor, polluting land, and dodging taxes through offshore loopholes. Journalists have exposed it. Citizens have protested it. Yet the ICC has never once opened a case on economic exploitation in the Sahel. So Africans are asking, can a court be called neutral when its indictments mirror NATO's foreign policy? Can it be trusted when it jails rebels but never the arms dealers who supply them? Captain Ibrahim Traoré said it plainly. A justice that serves empires, not the oppressed. His words weren't metaphor, they were history. Generations of African victims, from Chad, Somalia, Ethiopia, to Congo, have cried out for recognition. But when they speak, they're told to wait. When they demand trials, they're met with lectures. When they bleed, they're forgotten. What kind of justice turns its back on victims but opens its arms to aggressors? Legal scholars across Africa are now voicing what once was unspeakable. The ICC isn't merely failing Africa, it's upholding the very imbalance it claims to oppose. At the University of Lagos, researchers track how nations aligned with Western interests rarely face scrutiny. Analysts in Dakar point to how sanctions, indictments, and trade deals often move in lockstep. In Nairobi, protesters hold signs that read, "The ICC sees color, not crime." The illusion of impartiality has shattered. In its place stands a harder truth. The ICC is not above the world order, it is embedded within it. So the question becomes, if this is the architecture of global justice, who drew the blueprints? And who profits when the structure collapses? Supporters of the court argue it is constrained by the Rome Statute and the political realities of international diplomacy. But that argument cuts both ways. If a court only moves when it's politically safe, is it still a court or just a stage play dressed in robes? Africa must now ask itself, how long will it keep pleading its case in rooms where no one listens? How long will it submit evidence to institutions that treat its trauma as background noise? Kenya already knows this imbalance intimately. In 2013, William Ruto's first ICC case collapsed. Not because the crimes were disproven, but because witnesses vanished, protections failed, and political will dissolved. Now, in 2025, as blood returns to the streets of Nairobi, many fear history will repeat, not with a verdict, but with silence. And in that silence, Traoré's voice grows louder. If justice will not come from The Hague, then justice must come from Africa. The day after Captain Ibrahim Traoré unveiled his vision for a People's African Court, the continent responded, not with doubt, but with fire. What had begun as a speech in Burkina Faso had become a continental reckoning, a challenge to the very foundation of international law. From Kinshasa to Algiers, from Asmara to Bamako, support came quickly and firmly. The governments of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Mali, and Algeria issued joint statements backing the initiative. In Mali, Prime Minister Choguel Maiga called it a historic leap toward true sovereignty. In Eritrea, where suspicion of Western intervention runs deep, it was hailed as justice long overdue. Congo declared it an answer to centuries of external manipulation. Across radio waves, courtrooms, classrooms, and protest circles, one question now echoes. Can Africa finally build a justice system rooted not in power, but in memory, truth, and responsibility? The most powerful endorsement, however, didn't come from a government. It came from a group of lawyers. The Independent Bar Association of Ghana released a statement broadcast on national television. This is Africa's Nuremberg moment if we are brave enough. But what does it take to build a court that doesn't collapse into compromise? How do you write laws when the ink itself is soaked in centuries of betrayal? Even as Captain Ibrahim Traoré laid the foundation for a new vision of continental justice, Kenya's President William Ruto was doubling down on defiance. As the People's African Court was being drafted to hold leaders accountable, Ruto appeared on national television, brushing off scrutiny and declaring, "No foreign court will ever judge me." The contrast was stark. One man was building a path to justice. The other, fortifying a fortress of impunity. Can two Africas coexist? One where law serves the people, and another where power shields itself behind sovereign flags. Traoré's team revealed a blueprint steeped in symbolism and substance. The court would not be housed in Geneva, New York, or The Hague, but in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. The chosen site, 14 hectares of ancestral land outside the city. Its structure, built from local redstone, shaped by Morsi and Dune traditions. The courtroom would face east, greeting the morning sun, a symbol of transparency and rebirth. Its design would defy precedent. Judges would not be appointed by heads of state. They would be chosen by a continental council made up of civil society leaders, human rights activists, legal scholars, and victims' representatives. Anyone tied to ruling governments or foreign corporations. Disqualified. Because if Africa is to prosecute its own, it must first free the bench from power's grip. Legal frameworks are being drafted across the continent, through collaborations with universities from Cape Town to Dakar, and even with Dhaka's DOP University. This is not just about legal legitimacy. It is about moral authority. Each case would begin with truth commissions, proceed to regional hearings, and culminate in public trials open to global observation. From beyond Africa, the resonance is growing. In Atlanta, black legal scholars called it a new legal frontier. In Paris, diaspora associations gathered under banners reading, "Justice by the people, for the people." A quote echoed across platforms, from Al Jazeera to France 24. Finally, a court that listens to victims, not donors. But momentum alone is not victory. What will happen when the first indictment names a sitting president? When military elites or economic oligarchs face summons? When donor nations threaten funding? When judges receive threats instead of applause? Still, the foundation will be laid, literally. Construction is set to begin in September 2025. Delegations from Algeria, Congo, and beyond will attend the stone-laying ceremony. And at its center will stand Captain Ibrahim Traoré, now the symbol of this bold vision. Across headlines and banners, one phrase is taking root. Justice begins in Burkina Faso. Because this time, justice isn't flying in by plane. It's rising from the soil. When a leader authorizes bloodshed in broad daylight and walks free. When children fall to bullets and courts look away. Justice isn't just delayed. It's buried. In Kenya, President Ruto still governs unshaken. 70 dead in the streets of Nairobi. 500 injured. Over 500 arrested. And yet, no apology, no trial. The International Criminal Court, which once dared to name him, now falls silent again. A decade later, same crimes, same court, same silence. Only louder. Crueler. More certain. What kind of world lets power erase memory? What kind of justice bows before the presidency, while the people carry grief alone? But not all have chosen silence. In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before Africa and did something few dared. He offered an alternative. Not to protect men like Ruto, but to protect the people Ruto harmed. One silences dissent. The other amplifies it. One fears judgment. The other calls for it. So now we ask. Will the People's African Court become a monument or a movement? Will Africa rise to hold its own accountable? Or fall again into new traps dressed in old robes? We want to hear from you. What do you believe about William Ruto? About Captain Traoré? About the future of African justice? Will this court become our defense or another broken promise? What should justice in Africa look like? If you believe Africa must rise, write it below. Let the world see what unity sounds like. If this story stirred something in your chest, don't scroll past. White heavy checkmark like it if it shook you. Loudspeaker share it if you still believe justice is possible. Shield subscribe if you're ready to walk this road with us. Thank you for being here. From Kenya to Burkina Faso. From pain to promise. We are telling the stories others silence. We'll see you in the next chapter. This is an AI-narrated news report for educational and informational purposes only. It does not imitate or misrepresent any real person. All efforts are made to comply with YouTube's content policies. This is an AI-narrated news report for educational and informational purposes only. It does not imitate or misrepresent any real person. All efforts are made to comply with YouTube's content policies.